Team Society is a collection of scholars from across NTNU, and our mission is sort of twofold. On the one hand, we conduct research projects, and on the other hand, we try to promote and showcase social science and humanities perspectives from across NTNU on energy and climate related issues. And that is why we're here today, to listen to a very nice presentation by Laura Kim Sommer. And it's the best title we've had so far in this webinar series. Earth Without Art is Just an environmental psychological approach to climate communication. And as usual, we have a discussant with us, and today that is Marius Korsnes from the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture at NTNU. So he will give some comments after Laura's talk, and then we can all discuss following that. So without further ado, then I will unmute myself and give the floor to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and thanks for having me on this webinar. I'm really excited to be able to talk about my research again and to discuss it with Marius afterwards and to see what kind of questions come up. So I'm gonna jump right in with the presentation then. Basically, I'm going to present to you my dissertation and the studies that I conducted within my dissertation. We already covered the title, so we can continue. To give you an outline of the next 20 minutes, I'll first give you an introduction on what is climate change art and what can be defined as climate change art, followed by the aims and research questions of my dissertation, and then the studies, as I said, that I conducted as part of my PhD, followed by the conclusions and recommendations that I would like to give to artists or climate change communicators and campaigners who would like to reach out and use their creative practice in order to communicate climate change and other environmental pressing issues. So, climate change art is just one part of environmental art, eco art, land art, this kind of art that's using nature and bringing up topics of environmental practices has been, can be traced back to about 1960, but climate change art is more new. And Nurmis gave an overview over the scene and the discourse and the practices between 2005 and 2015. And she says that art that focuses on climate change and brings up that topic allows people to rethink their everyday practices and the effect that they themselves have on the climate system. And within the climate change art that has been happening in that decade, she says that there's a strong artistic trend towards apocalyptic images. And so she's asking, like, okay, so this might be leading to art that's very impressive and poignant, but does it lead to change within people? Next, I want to present some influential pieces of climate change art that I discussed in a book chapter on disruptive art and climate change communication that I just wrote. First of all, it's from like the end of the last century. Joseph Beuys, actually, I think I might have written the wrong date here. I think it was 1982 is right. It was part of the Documenta in Kassel. And so basically, Beuys wanted to plant and engage the citizens of the city of Kassel to plant 7,000 oak trees in the city that's very dominated by, or was very dominated by, car infrastructure. And so basically, he faced a lot of opposition, and it was a very difficult process. But over a couple of years, he managed to really have people plant all those trees. And so basically, his work, his piece of art, really changed the cityscape And now there's trees where beforehand there was none, and this has become like a cultural monument and has really had a huge impact on also urban planning. Then another influential piece of climate change art is Olafur Eliasson and Minik Rosing with Ice Watch. Basically, they took pieces from a glacier in Greenland, from a fjord in Greenland, and put them in the cities of London, Copenhagen, and Paris. And so people could experience and see the melting of the ice with their own senses. So they could obviously lick and hear and like experience what it means for all of this massive ice that we just make it melt. And another piece of influential climate change art that I'm not going to talk much about here because it's part of the studies that come up is Pollution Pots by Michael Pinsky. So the research questions that I wanted to answer, like the overarching research question is, what effect does this environmental art have on its audience? And more specifically, does environmental art, including climate change art, create engagement with the topic and increase viewers' policy support, environmental intentions, and behavior? And to do that, I used a theoretical framework combining art perception, so theory on how do people perceive art, and theory from environmental psychology. That's a field that basically looks at facilitators and barriers of pro-environmental behavior. And both art perception and environmental psychology tell us that emotions are a very important first reaction to an artwork. So you see a piece of art and you have an emotional reaction that can be either positive or negative, doesn't matter. And then there's cognition. So you start to process and think about, like, what does this mean for me? How is this piece of art relevant for me? And then the outcome is like the intentions and the behavior that you form based on this artistic experience. So I conducted 3 studies, actually 4, but I want to present 3 of them here as part of my dissertation. The first 2 are based on the same data that we collected at the Art Cop Festival in Paris, and the third one is the evaluation of the pollution pots. So aim of study 1 was to characterize psychologically effective environmental artworks. So to basically find out what characteristics of these artworks make them psychologically effective, if they are effective. And study 2 had the goal to identify the mechanism of environmental art perception, or basically like what I just showed you with the emotions, cognitions, and the outcome, to put like specific variables, define that, and then see if this model actually works. And the last one is to investigate the effect of the pollution pots on the emotional and cognitive reactions and the engagement they created in the end. Okay, so study 1. As I said already, we collected data, questionnaire data at the Art Cop 21. There was an art festival in Paris that took place parallel to the climate change negotiations in 2015. Marius was there as well. We traveled together to Paris. He watched the COP and I collected data with the questionnaires. And so basically, me and the research assistants that were there, we went to 37 different artworks that were exhibited all over Paris, and we collected data from 883 participants. So a really diverse range of artworks. As I said, we did a questionnaire survey, so we measured the emotions and cognitions people had to the artwork. And we also, whenever we came to a new piece of art, we looked at what material was it made of, what colors did it use, what kind of art is it? Is it an installation, a painting, a performance? Is it participatory, and so forth. So we had like a list of characteristics that we collected as well. Okay, so what I did in the analysis of the first paper is that I used the cluster analysis, which forms groups of artworks in this case, for which people are reacting in a similar way. So basically in cluster number 1, the comforting utopia, people were showing mostly positive emotions, such as happiness and hope. And the cognitive reactions they were having to it were relatively low. And the artworks that were in that cluster were characterized by that they were participatory, playful, they were having the topics of dreams and visions and utopia. So generally something you can understand that it made people feel happy and hopeful. Then the second group of artworks that I identified, I called it the mediocre mythology, because it was mediocre in the emotional and cognitive reactions, or relatively low in the reactions that people were showing to it in comparison to the other clusters. And the themes were that it had themes of mythology, and it was depicting the world as a whole and illustrating interconnectedness, like these kinds of things. Then cluster number 3, I called the challenging dystopia, because people were feeling mostly strong negative emotions, such as guilt, apathy, anger, when they saw these artworks. And the cognitive response was relatively high for the variables confrontational, so people felt really confronted. It made them aware of the impact of their behavior. It was relevant for their daily life. It was bringing up all that kind of thoughts about it. And these artworks were characterized by that they were showing technical or artificial objects. They were having the theme of dystopia, destruction, death, social oppression, were using lots of dark colors and metal, and they were mostly exhibited in art museums and galleries. Then last cluster, which contained only 3 artworks, was the awesome solution. And this cluster of artworks made people feel lots of positive, plus 1 high negative emotion, which was sadness and disappointment. So people felt like really emotionally positively activated. And they also triggered lots of strong cognitive reactions for nearly all of the variables that we were measuring. And this cluster was characterized by that it was showing solutions, making cause and effect of human behavior visible, depicting sublime nature, and it was colorful and mostly exhibited outside. So I'm going to go directly to study 2 and then draw conclusions for both studies together, because they're based on the same data. As I said already before in the aims section, that basically the goal of this study was to evaluate or see if the model of environmental art perception that I had defined beforehand works. And what I would like you to take away from this slide is, first of all, we have here again emotional reaction, then a cognitive process, and then in the end, as an outcome, the climate change policy support people were showing. And so we looked with a structural equation model at how do these variables or concepts relate to each other. And what I want you to take away from this slide is that negative emotions were strongly related to the reflections on the artwork, stronger than the positive emotions. But both positive and negative emotions had a positive effect on the reflections on the artwork. And the reflections on the artwork were then positively associated with the support for climate change policy. Then again, looking at the characteristics of the artwork, we could identify what kind of characteristics were associated with which psychological variable. So basically, we could identify that if the artwork was showing something personal, for example, that people could identify with, it was positively associated with positive emotions. Or if the artwork was huge, monumental in size, then this was positively associated with negative emotions. So we couldn't say in the study basically which characteristics are more likely to lead to certain kinds of emotions and cognitive reactions that people were showing, and thereby also to policy support. So to conclude from study 1 and study 2, emotions are important, and environmental art can definitely trigger these emotions. And I would say that also taking the results from study 2 into consideration, that positive and negative emotions are important to influence the reflections on the artwork, that both the awesome solution and the challenging dystopia contained art that was like having an effect on people. And regarding the cognitions, the artwork was effective when it helped people contemplate and reflect on the topics of the artwork, when it made them aware of the personal consequences of their behavior, and when it made them ascribe the responsibility to themselves. So people were saying, like, it's my responsibility to act and to do something against climate change. And if it also highlighted to them why is climate change or the environmental topic relevant for their daily lives. Coming to study 3. So as I said before, it evaluated the pollution pots, which was this huge installation by Michael Pinsky. And so basically the pollution pots are 5 geodesic domes that are connected to form a ring. And every dome represents a city from around the world. So you walk into Trondheim, followed by London, New Delhi, Beijing, and Sao Paulo, and then you come out again. And in every dome, you smell the air that's typical for those cities. So you get really a very immersive and bodily experience of the pollution levels and of the impact that climate change has in these different cities. So our study design was that we first measured the pro-environmental intentions before people entered the pollution pots. Then we let them experience the artwork, and afterwards we measured their emotional reaction to it, their cognitions, but also the pro-environmental intentions and the pro-environmental behavior. So we basically repeated the model in a sense that we measured the emotions, cognitions, and then the outcome again. And we also had a comparison group where people were just in Trondheim at the Torge, at the market square, and they did not see or experience the pollution pots. And they were also, we measured their emotions, cognitions, and intentions and behavior. And so the behavior measure was that we asked people to, when they came out of the pollution pots, to sign on to Ducky. That's like an online platform where they can log in their environmental behavior. And so we wanted to measure what kind of environmental behavior people were showing over a 2-week period after they saw the pollution pots, and then compare whether these people were showing more behavior than the people that had not seen the pollution pots. So hypothesis 1 was the pro-environmental behavior will be stronger in the pollution pots group as in the comparison group, as I just said. Unfortunately, the environmental behavior, we could not measure it. So the participation rate to log on to the platform and it was so low that it was 2% in the pollution pot group and 0% in the comparison group, which is really disappointing because we wanted to get this behavior measure, and it's one of the most difficult things in environmental psychology, to find a behavior measure that works. We could not find one. Then hypothesis 2 was that pro-environmental intentions will be stronger after the pollution pots than before, and stronger than in a comparison group. And again, we found that the mean intentions after the pollution pods was significantly higher than before, but that can also be basically it was the effect size of it was very small. So it can be that we just had a very big sample, and because of that, we had a significant result, and not because people were like so much changing their intentions. So we are still a bit unsure. We cannot really say that it was because of the pollution pods that the intentions were higher, but the intentions were higher, significantly higher than in the comparison group. Hypothesis 3 and 4 were that the emotional activation will be positively associated with increase in intentions to act, and the cognitions will also be positively associated with an increase in intentions to act. And what we found was that indeed, if people were feeling sad, helpless, or anger, they were more likely to increase their intentions to act. If they were ascribing the responsibility to themselves, also that increased their intentions. Also, awareness of consequences and reflections were important again, and relevance for daily life. And the more educated people were, that also had a small but significant influence on the increase in intentions. So to conclude from all three studies, I would like to say that environmental art can be a useful tool for climate change communication if it activates emotions and if it makes spectators reflect and contemplate, like assigning the responsibility to themselves and making them aware of the consequences and the relevance for daily life. If you are an environmental artist or communicator and you want to use your creative practice to reach out to people, I would recommend to consider what emotions and thoughts you want your audience to experience and try to make people feel through your art these emotions, and try to trigger thoughts on personal responsibility and consequences, as well as aim for high artistic quality, exhibit your work outside to make it accessible to people, and make cause and effect of human behavior visible. So that was it. Thank you for your attention. I'm curious what questions will come up now.
Fantastic. So then we do a virtual applause and give the word directly to Marius Korsnes, who will give some comments to this. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laura. That was a very interesting presentation, and I followed your work already for some time, and I think it's very interesting and important work that you've done. Yes, and I hope that this work you'll be able to continue with it in some form and try to reach out to a wider audience. I think I have several reflections on art on the one hand, and then also on climate change and how that can be linked on the other hand. So I think that if we just start with art in itself, I think for me the value of it is sort of the fact that it can challenge our ideas and our routines and habits, and it can so the power of an idea or the power of imagination is basically where the gold lies, if you'd ask me. But and in terms of participation and inclusion, or maybe not inclusion, but more engagement, how we can engage a wider audience, what would you kind of your thoughts be on that aspect? Because there is, of course, some critique connected to art, which is the fact that it's somewhat snobbish, that art is for someone that is rich and has time to focus on other things than the toils of everyday life. So so in that respect, what is the power that this art can have in, for example, being more engaging and being more accessible? And surely I don't think that the solution is that everyone goes through the pollution pods and then think more about the climate afterwards. So I wonder just if you can maybe provide some thoughts on a little bit on that.
Oh well, Marius, now you poked into, I would say, many different aspects of this. So first of all, about art and the art that is climate change art or environmental art. So when I wrote the dissertation, the challenge was first to combine the different kinds of fields, right? Because art in themselves, it has so many aspects and sides as a community in itself. So it's like the art that we know from the galleries, the art that we know from the museums, the art that is described as the fine arts. But then there's also lots of creative practices that can or cannot be described as art. And during my PhD, I often encountered the question like, so is this art or is this not art? I mean, we all have heard about this. But I think what most people can agree with is that everybody has had an experience with a piece of art that was touching them somehow, right? So I remember going to the museum in Vienna and watching like some works from Klimt and the groups there. And I was so emotionally touched by it that it stayed with me for a very long time. And I still think of this as something that was like triggering lots of emotions in me. So I think to have that discussion of is it art or is it not art might be in the context of creating engagement, not the most important thing. We can leave that to the art community to figure that out for themselves. What I think is the most important here is like, is it impactful in a sense, like, does it touch me? Does it touch people? Does it somehow stir something in them? And I think I agree with you, that's where the goal of art lies. But I must also say that it's difficult. I mean, apart from that, we all had that experience of that there was this piece of art that touched me personally. We also have lots of experiences that we are exposed to different kinds of form of art and creative practices on a regular basis. We watch YouTube videos, we see like posters in the streets or whatever. And not everything is as impactful. So it's very rare to find something that touches so many people that it can really create engagement, and that, you know, now in these times with social media, things are going viral, right? So I would say if something goes viral, most likely it has touched many people on a significant level. So yeah, maybe some of the art is snobbish. Maybe the art world sometimes is profiting from it to be snobbish. Maybe sometimes there's also lots of streams within the art that are trying to make it more accessible. And I think many of these artists, like Michael Pinsky for sure and Olafur Eliasson, they try to make it very, very accessible. And they try to create engagement with people in the streets, and not just in museums and galleries.
Thank you. And another aspect that I think I actually discussed with you in the past as well is this this point about pointing fingers or really making people feel bad about what they're already doing. And you mentioned it in your findings as well, that it actually seems to be sometimes effective to actually show some of these dystopian futures or dystopian kind of effects of human behavior here on Earth. And and I thought, like from what I've just heard, I thought that it was kind of established that that's not effective, that it's not effective to, you know, make people feel bad and make them feel guilty, because it just leads to this sort of you basically disconnect from the world rather than connect with it, and you just continue with your your everyday life, because you don't like that anyone else is poking fingers into our lives. So, but could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? I know that there is some research on that field, and you have provided some of that research as well. So.
Yeah. Actually, that's a great question, because after I finished my PhD, I got more curious and looked more into the specifics, emotions, because what I think is important here, okay, you can't say that all negative emotions are the same in the reactions that they're causing. So I just wrote this book chapter, as I said, on the disruptive art. And I looked specifically at the emotional reactions that can trigger, and what research from environmental psychology is telling us about the specific emotions and how they most likely make people react. And so these findings have shown us that there are a couple of negative emotions that have been found to be associated with pro-environmental intentions and even pro-environmental behavior. Like, for example, guilt and worry have been, and also anger has been found to be associated with actions, because it's very action driving in a sense. If you feel guilty, you want to change something about that feeling of guilt, you want to feel better. If you are angry, it's an emotion that drives more a behavior. But if you then have a negative emotions, like that you're anxious and that you're afraid of something, like, for example, fear has been used in many ways, mostly in health psychology, to motivate people to not act in an unwanted way. So we all know that on cigarette packages there are like these fear-inducing images. And there have been many discussions and lately meta-analysis on it, and showing that inducing fear is not effective, because inducing fear is only effective if people feel able to deal with the actual behavior. So many people feel the fear when they see the pictures, but they don't know how to quit smoking. And since they don't know how to quit smoking, they tend to ignore the fear message instead of acting on it, because they don't know how. And as soon as people know how to quit smoking, or how to cope with the fear that's been induced, then they turn to action. But many times also with climate change, people don't know what to do. People are in many places really not informed about what is a good behavior in order to mitigate climate change, and what is a good behavior in order to reduce my personal carbon footprint. Many people, when I talk to them about environmental behavior, still tell me, oh, I recycle. Right? Yeah, and we both know that recycling is one of the least effective means of reducing your carbon footprint. Because if you recycle, still many of the materials are not being recycled in the end. And it's first important to reduce the materials that we're using, instead of consuming mindlessly and then saying, oh, I'm just recycling everything afterwards. So yeah, I think it's important to look at different kinds of emotions and see what works. There are definitely some negative emotions that work and some that don't.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good point. So there's not one thing, one big bunch of negative emotions that we should group together and should not address them, but we can actually be more nuanced about it and figure and go more into detail about it. That's a very good point.
Yeah.
I don't know how much more time I have for questions and things.
There has been lots of hands going up.
Yeah, there's lots of interest. So if you have a final thing here.
No, I just had one small question about this. What is kind of the lasting effect of these different interventions? I mean, could be that people that are exposed to these interventions can feel something in the moment, and then what happens afterwards is kind of the next question as well. Do you have any? I think that you probably have reflected a little on that as well in your work, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I can only make assumptions. So since we didn't do any long-term studies out of it, and we didn't as I said we had problems with the behavior measure. I could only make assumptions, and I think that's not the point here. So I think, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. I will stop the questions from my side here, but I would like to congratulate you with some very good work. So